We live in a secular age, as philosopher and social theorist Charles Taylor announces in his famous tome from 2007. We live in an age where it's difficult to regain a sense of enchantment. We live in an age in which often we feel buffered and divorced from meanings out in the world. We often assume meanings only come from our own mind and that we don't encounter transcendent meanings, let alone meanings in nature or meanings resident somehow within reality. And so we get to a point in which many people feel a malaise, even a sort of sadness, gloominess, not everyone, but many people, around a disconnect between modern people and sources of enchantment or deeper meaning. How can you regain enchantment in a secular age? Taylor has a lot to say about this, and I'm just going to offer a couple very brief and provocative thoughts that he has on it. Toward the end of his massive meta-narrative on the emergence of a secular age, which has partly been inadvertently constructed not merely by people who don't believe in Orthodox religion, but also by reformers and counter-reformers in the Protestant and Catholic churches who help to transform the kind of self that is typical of our culture from a porous, spooky, superstitious, if you like, one that is typical of the medieval age, to a modern one that perceives itself within a grid or immanent frame. Newton and science play a role as part of this larger narrative as well, but they're by no means the full encompassing horizon. They play a part in a much larger shift of meaning, or what Taylor refers to as sources of self. How do we go from, are we trapped in the immanent frame? Are we trapped in sort of the grid of immanent Newtonian punctual time and space and material objects? Taylor's answer is no. There are actually opportunities to re-enchant the cosmos, but they're different. They arrive differently in some ways than they did for people in prior epochs. Perhaps the one he's most interested in is the emergence of what he calls an ethics of authenticity that he associates with the Romantic movement and its rejection and rebellion against the hyper-rationalism of the Enlightenment. Taylor thinks that the Romantic movement in Europe, which later becomes a mass movement through the 60s cultural revolutions, introduces a kind of ethical self that prizes expressive authenticity. The Romantics and the 1960s cultural revolution insist on finding an authentic self. Taylor admits this can often take on trite and sort of dumbed down versions, if you think of the way that consumer culture often uses the language and code and ethics of the Romantics and its expressive individualism to say things like, you'll be fully yourself if you just buy these tennis shoes or eat this hamburger, right? Or put on this hat or something like that. But Taylor says in spite of these trivializing forms, there are also some very deep forms that have become typical of many, many modern people that you might identify as a Neo Porous Self, a self that is not porous in the way of the medieval peasant that superstitiously thought there were wood sprites and gods or demigods or spirits or demons in the river or the earthquakes or what have you. But instead a self that's porous because in its search for authenticity, in its search for meanings and expressivity, it finds the transcendent opened up again in aesthetic events or experiences. So the Romantics give us a self that searches for deeper sources of meaning. Taylor discusses poetry and other arts as a mode of moral realism in which we can encounter meanings outside of the mind. Moderns will often be open to experiencing re-enchantment through art and poetry, and art and poetry that sometimes cues them into a different experience of nature, nature as enchanted through its beauty, in poems like those of Gerard Manley Hopkins, say, right? In which moderns do something very peculiar, very typical of the romantic ethic of authenticity, which is to go find a sense of authenticity in nature before the beauty of the ocean, before the beauty of a single leaf, as Kirillov says in Dostoevsky's Demons. Just a single leaf can stay eternally in your mind, one you saw in childhood, in the fall, with its yellow veins. There, we can have these moments of aesthetic communion with reality around us that re-enchants it through the poetic, also through events in life, sometimes sudden and extreme conversion moments. Think of Raskolnikov in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, who murders thinking he is beyond the ordinary moral laws, but finds in his very disastrous act of evil a set of meanings that push back against his actions, that re-enchant the meanings of things for him. In other words, re-enchantment and porousness can happen through an encounter with meanings resident within the event of reality itself, the poetics of reality itself, of being. Being itself can reappear as poeticized. And romantic art, expressive art, is one of the main sites in which modern selves, in their search for authenticity and meaning, can have contact again with enchantment. And many people still experience enchantment through these modes. There's also, as part of this, a return of the festive, what Taylor calls a return of the festive. Festive is a collective, enchanted form that Taylor thinks stretches back many, many centuries, where people have collective times that they get together and they exit the ordinary. In their togetherness, they have a moment outside of the ordinary. Some of these were suppressed by reformers both within the Protestant and Catholic traditions, who tried to suppress them as part of a kind of moralism and rigor of belief. But Taylor thinks that there's the resurgence of folk and popular attempts to be in contact with enchanted or sacred time through the festive. Carnivals, pilgrimages. Think of the way that modern people are deeply attracted to out of the ordinary experiences that they do together in concerts, musical concerts, in going to extremes, right? To do something within nature, like climb a mountain or run a marathon. Think of running a marathon together, right? It's strange. The marathon running doesn't happen, say, in New York with so many people, or Los Angeles, because they all think they're going to win. They don't think they're going to win. They do it together because it takes them out of the ordinary. Now, whether or not there's a true profundity to all of these forms, every rock concert or every act of going and climbing a mountain or with other people, or running a marathon, Taylor's bigger point is that enchantment and a neo-porousness can happen sometimes through these festive moments, a return in hunger, nostalgia that people have for the festive. And so Taylor has something very interesting to say to his fellow co-religionists. He, as a Catholic Christian, thinks that oftentimes traditional churches and religions misunderstand the circumstances that face them. They think of secularism as a hostility as opposed to an opportunity. But this is because they misread or misinterpret the meaning of secularity. They don't understand the contours of a social imaginary shared and created as an immanent frame. And they tend to view expressiveness and authenticity and the romantics as a corrosive, backwards individualism that is a threat to real traditional, beliefs or churches and its moral rigors. And so they tend to cast out what Taylor calls these seekers and oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes don't accompany them on their search. Taylor thinks this is a huge mistake because essentially what you're doing is closing the door on one of the major conduits by which modern people still achieve, or achieve might not be the right word. It's not on their efforts. They encounter enchantment or meanings that transcend their own, say, mind or their own sense of the ordinary. It's in the authentic search. These seekers are actually the ones who, in some senses, have the clearest awareness of the possibility of re-enchantment, even if sometimes they bristle at orthodoxy of belief or orthodoxy of morality. And so the churches need to find a way, according to Taylor, to accompany this explosion and fragmentation of searches and seekers. Taylor does not think the modern epoch is one that's primarily marked by unbelief. He thinks instead we have an explosion of forms of religious searching and seeking. He tends to think of atheism and agnosticism themselves as often colored by deep religious impulses or spiritual sources. Even some, superficial forms of New Ageism, therapy and spirituality, but also the search sometimes for Eastern religion, sometimes eclecticism. There are better and worse versions of this, but in the many, many, many exploding novas, as he says, and options, the wide and varied social spiritual order of secularity, Christians shouldn't see simply a retreat of the religious. They should see new, fertile ground, if challenging and different, for how to come into communion with people who are seeking re-enchantment amid secularity.